Christian parenting.
Welcome to the Called to Love podcast, where we discuss all things adoption and foster care and dive into the practical, the clinical, and most importantly, the biblical perspectives to help you and your family thrive. I'm Summer Colbert, adopted mom, director of adoption and foster ministry, and champion for the Arkansas Baptist Children and Family Ministries. Adoption and foster care aren't just a process. They are both unique invitations to go on a journey with the Lord, where you will experience life-changing opportunities to grow in your faith and learn to love in an entirely new way. One thing is for sure, being called to love means you will never be the same. I am so grateful that you are joining me today, and I am so grateful to welcome Hillary as my guest. Hillary, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited for this. Friends, this is the Mama Bear apologist herself. I told her before we hit live today, I'm totally fangirling a little bit. I have so enjoyed your ministry and all that God has you doing. And I'm really excited for our topic today. We are going to be talking about a guide to sexuality and how we as Christian parents can help our kids navigate this oftentimes uncomfortable subject for us as parents. And you have written a fantastic book, which is the Mama Bear Apologetics Guide to Sexuality. And so as we're diving into our conversation today, I want to be very honest, and I want to challenge our parents. And I also want to, as you do so beautifully, bring that scripture-based and that apologetics perspective to this conversation, because I think it is so valuable in a world that is just trying to distort God's design for sex.
Yeah.
And so as we think about all of the ways that it is being distorted, how our children are just being inundated with this early sexualization, with this confusion about gender and identity and things that go on in bedrooms that they really shouldn't know anything about, but yet somehow the world is pushing and pushing for them to know about that at younger ages. Let me just lead off with a very loaded question. We're just going to see where the Lord takes us in this conversation. Where in the world do we start when it comes to Christian parenting through this topic of sexuality?
Yes, I think that's a great question, and that was probably the question I had when this was not a book that I was like, yeah, I want to write this. This is one that the publishers had asked me multiple times, and then my husband was like, you need to do this. But where do I start? Oh my gosh, because it's like a giant plate of spaghetti, and someone's like, will you organize this for me? And you're like, sure,
Right.
I'll try to do that. So I think just where to start, right? Especially if you have littles, this is something I call just establishing categories. That I would say one of the number one things that are kind of messing up our youth and messing up our kids and the ability to understand what sex is and what God created sex to be is having it in the right category. So if you think about learning as like a file cabinet and everybody's filing things away, I'll say that when I was growing up, sex, I had a really, really healthy teaching of sex through my church. But if I were to look at of course, for me, the category of sex was in things you do when you're married. If I were to just get it off of TV, it would be things that you do when you're really, really in love. Now, fast forward a little bit, maybe, mid 90s, early 2000s, it's things you do when when you're dating somebody.
Right.
And I would say fast forward to now, the category is things you do either when you're at a party or things you do the moment that you recognize that you and this person are attracted to each other. I cannot count the number of times. It's so irritating where it's like these two characters are like bickering or doing something. And then they have this moment where they like agree on something. And they all of a sudden look at each other, and the next moment is them like ripping each other's clothes off. And I'm like, really?
Right.
That's all it takes is for you to finally agree on something and think, hey, we're kind of attracted to each other. Maybe this should be the next step.
Seriously.
And so I think categorizing things correctly would be our first step. And so, like, number one, it's perfectly good to have the things that you do when you're married category for sex. But there's another category that I kind of created for the book, and that's things you do that repeat a promise that was already made, or physical things you do that repeat a promise that was already made. So this is something where if you're trying to get it with your littles, try doing things where you make a promise and you say, okay, this handshake that we're going to do is always going to point back to this promise we made. And
That's cool.
so it's like the handshake would mean nothing if you hadn't already promised something. It would be just
Yeah.
kind of, pointless. But if it's pointing back to a promise you made, not only are you putting sex in its correct place, which is within marriage, but you're actually making sex outside of marriage not make sense because you
Mm,
can't point back to a promise that you never made.
that's
And
great.
so that would be kind of where I start. And the other category I would place this in is things that are so powerful that they need to be guarded, and things that are able to create and destroy. So the
Yeah.
analogy I use is fire. Like fire is able to create and it's able to destroy. The fact that it can do both tells us that we need to be very, very careful with it. And I would say sexuality is one of those things. It can create a new baby, it can create just like love, it can create bonds, it creates neurochemistry, it creates all these things, but it
Yes.
can also destroy. Like someone's asked me before, if you were to like make one law that you think would change the world, I'm like, okay, I would make the law that nobody's allowed to have sex with anyone but their spouse. Think of the number of things that would go away, anywhere from just all the divorces that are from unfaithfulness to
Right.
unwanted pregnancies to uh, all the STDs. Like, I mean,
Right.
it's not going to fix everything, but good grief, it would fix a lot of things.
Yeah.
So I can't even remember where I was going with that. Yeah, just things that are so powerful that can create and destroy. And so you might say something like, hey, is a fire good or bad? And just kind of ask them what do they think about that. And they might be thinking of forest fires, and they're like, ooh, fires are bad. And you're like, well, what about when we make a fire to when we cooked on the cookout? What about,
Yeah.
what was that good? What about when we have candles? Oh yeah, I guess that's good too. It's a
Yeah.
neutral thing that can be good or bad depending on the environment and depending on when and
Yeah.
where you take part in this. And so these are the kind of categories we need to be starting up with our kids, so that when they start talking about sex, they actually
Mhm.
know what we're talking about in the first place. At least kind of like a not only a moral but a practical category that they can understand. Because saying safe or dangerous isn't necessarily a moral category, but it is a practical category. And that's where apologetics comes in, is we say this practical wisdom, this common sense ideas, things where you see the revenge of reality, where try as we might to make this something else, it's always going to be what it's going to be. And sex is one of those things where it is always going to create some kind of bond, or it's always going to hurt somebody. It's very rarely that you
Right.
just have something completely neutral and it leaves a human being untouched, because sex was not meant to do that. It was meant to um yeah, it was meant to create and to forge bonds that were not meant to be broken.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And you're absolutely right in the fact that, everything that's depicted in media, there's no consequences
Nope.
ever shown. And so we as parents have to come in. And I love how you frame that and also how you're causing your kids to think. Because, and I know a lot of our listeners here, and myself included, were Gen Z parents. And so a lot of us grew
Gen
up during
Z.
the age where it was like, sex is bad. Like,
Mm,
sex is bad until marriage. And then you get married and you're supposed to be a porn star on the other side of that. Like, there
yes.
was no media ground, and everything was very, we don't talk about that. I mean, like, parents were like reverse pucker faced because they just didn't even want to say anything because it just made them so uncomfortable. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? And so with that, it's like we as this generation of parents are trying to find a way to not only normalize the language and the sex talk as it is.
Mhm.
I think about, it's like, oh, we've got to go have the talk, and then our kids are terrified and they're like, okay, I'm translating. This is something really bad and scary. And then we're like, sex bad, marriage good, and then it's just really confusing. And so we've had to do a lot of deconstructing of that messaging as
Yes.
adults. When we became married, and it was like all of a sudden it's okay to do these things and not only do them, but enjoy them. And so with that, we've got this flooding of the over sexualization in our media, in our entertainment, and all these different things, even stinking commercials. I'm like, when you have to look at your 3-year-old and they're like, what's ED? Because there's a commercial on there about that, kind of a thing. And so, Hillary, where do we start with the sex talk and normalizing the language to begin introducing that conversation that then leads into what you're talking about with giving them examples and causing them to really think about the consequence?
Yeah, I would say one of the first things you have to do is start normalizing the words themselves.
Yeah.
So, for example, and one of the reasons why you want to start normalizing this is actually kind of a two-part reason. Is number one is just the amount of we hate to talk about it, abusers that are out there.
Yeah.
I've read stories where a kid was saying that I was in this play place, like those things where it's like you're crawling through this little tunnel, and there was a kid behind him, and he said he kept touching my butt, but what he didn't wasn't able to get across to his mom is this kid was putting his finger in his anus.
Oh,
That's
man.
more than touching the butt. And so he
Right.
needed to have language for that. I know another person who was a teacher. This girl kept going, my uncle keeps touching my cookies. And so she kind of laughed it off, thinking, oh, her uncle's like sneaking some of her cookies. This girl loves cookies.
Right.
Until the mom comes for like parent teacher night. And something happens and she refers to the girl's cookies. And all of a sudden that teacher realized this child was trying to tell her, my uncle's touching me in an inappropriate way.
Oh, my.
And so, like, we are past the time when we need to be shy about this. We need to know the
Right.
difference between the butt, the anus, the vagina, the vulva, the breast, all these different things. And you can say, this is what, make sure that they know what it is. Now, you don't have to use that everywhere. Your child doesn't have to be in the middle of Costco and be like, my penis needs to pee. It's like there's
Right.
times when you can use it and times when you don't need to.
Yeah.
Euphemisms are fine as long as everybody knows what we're talking about here.
Right.
But we need to start having that conversation. Number two, I think we need to start talking about good things that have we get into the conversation of the fall of man, and just this is something we need to be doing with kids basically from the time they're born till
Yeah.
till the time they're grandparents, and which is basically talking about the fall and talking about specific ways that the fall has affected our lives. So now when they're really little, you can talk about the fall in terms of, see, this is sickness. We were not originally supposed to have sickness, or,
Yeah.
scraping the knee or doing all these things. And you can also talk about great things that were created, and it's amazing how when you scrape your knee, your body just heals it by itself. So you're
Yeah.
just talking about things that are broken, and you're
Right.
talking about things as they were created. So when you start talking about sexuality, you can start out that conversation saying, you know what, this is one of those categories that has been very, very broken. Remember how we talked about the fall and how a lot of evil stuff came in? This is one of those areas where we've had a lot of evil come in, but you know what? Evil comes in the most on things that God intended to be the most beautiful and the greatest
Right.
things. And so the
Yeah.
more evil we see, the more good we know was created to be there. Okay, so let's talk about what sex is. I really prefer, and this is just me as a nerd, and just I'm a science nerd. I have my master's in biology. I like showing kids the way that sex was physiologically intended to create that bond between husband and wife. And so this is kind of a weird one where I've got two chapters that I would recommend for this. Number one is chapter 3. It's called A Really Great Design When Followed. But the other one that really goes through the physiological stuff is the pornography chapter, that really goes
Mm.
into the neurochemical and neurobiological aspects of what sex was intended to be, to bind
Yeah.
husband and wife together. And sometimes doing it kind of like that, when your kids think you're just talking about science, we can flip back and forth from theology to science, and sometimes it'll make it a little less awkward than
Mm.
talking about, when a mommy and daddy really love each other, they take off
Right.
their, it's like, okay, this is getting awkward.
The kids are like, "What?"
Yeah, I don't want to know about that. But they could talk about things almost in a clinical stance to where they can
Yeah.
understand that. They can understand the theology. They can understand implicitly this is what happens when people love each other. But it's
Yeah.
done in a way to where they don't have to sit there because, parents kiss and their kids go blah, they, gag. They don't want to think, they don't want to think about their parents doing that. But at the same
Right.
time, that if the parents weren't kissing around them, they would miss that. They wouldn't feel as secure. So making your
Right.
kids get all grossed out with your PDA, it's awesome. It's one of the things that
Yes.
they'll pretend they hate, but they love. But so
Absolutely.
that would be one of my things for if I were trying to get into the sex talk and be able to do it in a way that I felt comfortable and they felt comfortable. Now, someone
Mhm.
else may have no qualms about just talking about the love aspect and just all the mechanics and stuff like that, which is important. You need to talk about that. You need to talk about the mechanics. But I find that
Yeah.
once you start acclimating them to this topic with all these other things that are a little less shall we say, emotionally charged, then when you start getting to the emotionally charged place, you've actually established just kind of a safe space of, okay, we're talking
Yeah.
about things here.
Hey, friends. You know, here on the show, we talk a lot about making sure that our kids feel seen and that they feel safe. And sometimes we can't be with them throughout the day when they might be experiencing some anxiety or some sad feelings. And Christian Parenting actually just released a fantastic resource that I think will be fantastic for foster and adoptive parents, just to give our kids that reassurance all throughout the day, even when we can't be with them. These are called scripture affirmation cards, and they're a really fun and easy way to help your kids grow in confidence and an unshakable faith and feel comfort throughout the day when they can't be with mom and dad. Each card has a unique biblical truth and affirmation that is rooted in scripture, and it gives your kids a powerful tool to affirm their identity in Christ, to align their thoughts with God's word, and to give them the confidence that they need to face any of the issues or insecurities that they might be feeling throughout the day. Simple things like, what if I don't make the team? What if I don't have anyone to sit with at lunch? Or our anxiety kiddos who might think, what if things don't go as planned? Or what if I feel lonely or worried? These are perfectly sized so that your kids can bring them wherever they go and be reminded that they are loved by you and by God. I personally have loved leaving mine in lunch boxes and lockers and jacket pockets, and it's just a sweet little hug for mom and dad throughout the day to let them know that we love and see them. To get a copy of your cards, you can go to www.cpgive.org, and I'll have that link in today's show notes. Now let's get back to the conversation. Yeah. Oh, I agree. And what you're talking about is laying a foundation
Hmm.
that can just be built on at an age appropriate level. And we now, I think, we know that there's nothing new under the sun. We know that God destroyed a whole city over the distortion of what sexuality was
Yeah.
intended to be. And so obviously this is something that's been going on for a really long time, but for us it just feels so in our faces right now. And so we've got to have this foundation with our kids and that basic understanding and everything that you've laid out for us so far, Hillary. So moving into that, we've got to have some form of biblical mindset approach to the distortion
Yes.
that we're seeing at every turn, what our
Yes.
kids are hearing at school, what they're hearing at church camps, what they're hearing, I mean, pretty much everywhere.
Hmm.
And it is just a constant, it feels like a game of whack-a-mole
Yes.
to us as parents trying to, shield and guard, but also inform
Hmm.
because they can't live in bubbles all their lives.
Yeah.
This is the world we live in. And I believe that God placed us as parents for the here and now to equip our kids to continue in generations who still follow hard after God, who understand his words and his principles. But with that, we have the clear examples of, certainly, as you mentioned, pornography being one of the key distortions of sexuality and objectifying women and causing all of the different physiological things that come with an addiction to pornography, which we've talked about multiple
Yeah.
times on the show. But also then now the sexual identity crisis, where you're talking about naming body parts, and all of a sudden now there's, I don't even know how many genders we're at right now, Hillary. You may know that better than I am, but they've named all of these genders that they think that they can identify at. And here's what's so aggravating to me. If your gender doesn't affirm, if your body parts don't affirm your gender, then why does cutting it off
Yes.
affirm? You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
It's
This
so
is a great.
distorted.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, lean into that for us because I'm like, there's all of this out there. And we as Christian parents are like, listen, I'm just trying to get, keep the tiny humans alive at some point. And then, like, I'm being like inundated with all of this stuff and trying to deflect and filter and translate and all of that. So, when it comes to the distortion of sexuality, where do we start?
Yeah. Can you see my sign right behind me said today's goal, keep the tiny humans alive?
Oh my gosh, I need that.
Yeah. So yeah, the distortion. I think if I were to summarize the number one lie that is being believed around sexuality, it's that humans are able to flourish in something that they weren't created for.
Mm,
I'm going to say that again, that humans are able to flourish in something that they weren't created for.
that's
Um,
good.
this is the number one lie. And the truth part of that is we can't flourish in something that we weren't created for. And so, in order to understand how to flourish, because everything is phrased in terms of flourishing, if you've noticed, harm
Oh, yeah.
reduction and flourishing, that's how everything is phrased. If we truly want to
Yes.
flourish, if we truly believe that God designed this and he has a purpose, then we want to flourish. And this is the way to flourish, is doing it according to his design.
Yeah.
And so I would say, yeah, number one, if we're talking about the gender, we need to specify that personality, interests, um, uh, skill sets are on a spectrum. Gender is not.
Mm.
There is sperm and egg. I always take it back to, they're like, "Oh, gender's not binary." I was like, "Okay, find me something between sperm and egg. Find me this like
Right.
proto pseudo sperm and this proto pseudo egg or this sperm egg, a sperm egg is
Yeah.
called an embryo, come on, or a zygote." It's like there is nothing in between there. And so you have bodies that are built around the production of sperm, and that's not just one hormone, that's the whole
Yeah.
body.
Yeah.
Then you have bodies, and our bodies are so much more complicated, I think, because producing sperm's not that big of a deal. It's kind of like all the males' roles of protection and all that stuff that makes them,
Yeah.
their bones denser, and all these different things that goes into kind of manhood. But for us, our body is designed and built around carrying a child, growing and carrying a child in our bodies. And our
Yeah.
entire physiology is built around that. There's nothing in between that egg and sperm. And so I think many times as we can, talking about personality, interest, styles, fashion, whatever you want to have, those exist on a spectrum. Gender does not. The
Yeah.
other thing I would point out is that to have a spectrum, you have to have two opposite ends from which to compare them. So if I said, "Oh, I did this test and I scored a 5 on it," well, you're going to say, "Well, is that good or is that bad? Was it on a scale of 1 to 5?" If it was a scale of 1 to 5, well, then good job. Was it a
Yeah.
scale of 1 to 100? Like, really sorry, you're like one of the worst ever.
Right.
And ironically, I have on a scale of 1 to 100 scored a 5 on my finger dexterity. So that was back in high school. So I always that's my fun little thing. I can't do
I
anything
love
with
it.
my hands. But so if we're saying that gender's on a spectrum, you have to identify, well, what's this end of the spectrum and what's that end of the spectrum? What is 100% female and what is
Yeah.
100% male? Because they
Yeah.
don't exist. They don't
Right.
exist. If you have kids that are old enough to understand this, basically what we have when it comes to even what people would call gender identity is at best scatter plots that have
Mm.
tendencies, but you still have anomalies from that. But it doesn't change whether or not you're an egg producer or a sperm producer.
Right.
And then I think, like you said, this idea of we have to ask, do, do our bodies matter for our gender, or do our bodies not matter for our gender? Because someone needs to answer that one of two ways. Yes, your body matters for your gender, or no, your body doesn't matter for your gender. If your body does matter for your gender, then you should listen to it and
Mm.
for it to inform you. If your body doesn't matter for your gender, then why are you trying to change your body as if your body mattered? Either way,
Exactly.
we can like have this beautiful life. And this is one of the points that I actually make in the gender confusion chapter, is that
Mhm.
people have this idea that transitioning is so freeing. And I'm like, I don't think they understand. They think it's this one and done surgery where suddenly, yeah, I've got, boy parts,
Right.
girl parts. I don't think they understand that this is a lifelong set of hormones. This is lifelong shots. This is lifelong
Right.
medical issues. And sometimes
Right.
these surgeries don't go well. And
Right.
sometimes for girls, they're never going to be able to, we'll say, experience a climax of sex. Even sometimes
Right.
with the puberty blockers, they're finding that they're creating girls that can never experience the climax of sex.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, with the and so this would be an example of, do you think this is causing more flourishing, or do you think this is not flourishing, by
Yes.
going away from how God designed it to be?
Yes.
And then secondly, if we want to talk about sexuality, so that would just be identity and gender identity. There was this people often say that if we just had a society that was more accepting, then people wouldn't be depressed, we wouldn't have the suicide rates, we wouldn't have all these things. So one day I decided, and I wish I'd done this before the book came out, and I wish I put it in the book, but I didn't think of it at the time because we were moving so fast.
Right.
But I said, I was like, what's the most accepting society? So I Googled it to find out who the most accepting society was, and it was Norway.
Mhm.
And
Huh.
so then I looked for studies in Norway to see what the suicidality was there. And what I found was even more than what I was looking for, that they actually categorized adolescents. So we're talking first off about adolescents. So these are people who are probably not married, who probably shouldn't be having sex because that's not
Right.
what they were created for. Sex was
Right.
created for marriage. And they looked at the increasing rates. Like, they started out with maybe just a scale of, the heterosexual identifying, not sexually active, started out, we'll
Okay.
just say, at 1. That's their baseline for suicidality. The next one they went to was same sex attracted, but not sexually active. So these are the people who identify, and you see the suicidality go up maybe like to 3. So like 3 times as
Mm,
often. And
okay.
then you saw heterosexuality identified sexual activity, and you
Mhm.
see the suicidality go up a little more.
Mm,
And then you see same sex attracted and sexually active, and that suicidality went off the charts.
really?
And so it's kind of showing it. This is very much looking at Romans 1. Every little way we get away from the way God designed sex,
Yep.
this every single step away, it's just this culture of death. And if you're like, hey, I have no problem with my friends wanting to be in the culture of death, then you don't love your friends.
Amen.
So it's like in this, with this again, I use that phrase, the revenge of reality. The revenge of reality is when you in your head say, oh no, I can have all this stuff and I can still flourish, and this will be great. I can create utopia on my own. Reality
Yeah.
keeps coming back in and bursting that bubble. At least it does on a population level in terms of what we can study within
Yeah.
trends. You might be able to find that one person who is you know actively involved in all sorts of deviant sex, and they're completely happy and completely well adjusted. I'd love to meet them.
Right.
But for the most part, this is the trend that you're going to see. And so this kind of brings us back. So I said the number one lie was that we can flourish in something that we weren't created for. And
Yeah.
so at that point, we need to say, what was I created for? And this is the
Yeah.
concept of telos that we go through. I think in the second chapter of the book, and then we kind of weave it in through the rest of the chapters.
Here's what I love about that, because what you're drawing us into is this idea of what I want to talk about with you next as we're wrapping up our conversation today, which we've got to do a part 2 because this is just awesome. Um, but this concept of, well, if you don't accept me, you don't love me.
Yes.
And so, as Christian parents trying to teach kids to stand on their faith and to stand on the truth of God's word, who says there are only 2 genders and sex is for marriage, and the world is trying to distort it in all these ways. And we're seeing the destruction. We're seeing how these people are at the end of the day trying to fill that God sized hole in their
Mhm.
hearts with things that are not only failing to do so, but they're also wreaking havoc on their bodies and their souls,
Yeah.
right? But in the meantime, they're accusing and pointing fingers at those of us who are trying to rescue them from the lies that they're believing, as you said.
Yeah.
And then we're trying to teach our kids how to stand strong in that when they're like, well, you're just being judgmental
Yeah.
and the Bible's irrelevant and you need to honor my pronouns because that's how you show love to me. Or, whatever the accusation is, it's the same thing. It goes back to, like, you're
Yeah.
talking about the fall of man in the garden, where did God really say? And
Yeah.
there's all these ways of just manipulating that language. And then our kids are going, I don't know. So, I mean, how do we coach our kids through that, Hillary?
So again, this is one of those things where preparation is so important. I think you need to, as a parent, be looking for things that you disagree with people on, or that you disagree with your kids on, or that you disagree with your spouse on, and in front of your kids say, you know what, I disagree with you on that, but I still love you, and then hug. That's what you can do
Mm,
with your spouse. You want them to hear this phrase over and over again. So the first time they hear it isn't when you're talking about pronouns.
that's
You
good.
want to emphasize every time y'all disagree and be like, "Oh, I disagree with you, but I love you." And then hug and teach your kids that that's what you're going to do. Then by
Yeah.
the time this pronoun conversation comes along, you can say, "You know what? I disagree, but," and they know how to finish it. "I love you." So I would say that's one thing, but when you're dealing with someone who either you haven't had the chance to have all these conversations, one of the stories that I know that is very popular within LGBTQ stuff is they are so convinced that this person is rejecting them that I think it's good sometimes for things to be stated. So what you do is you say, you know what, I love being friends with you. I love being your friend, your mother, your uncle, your whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and I can see that this is an area you and I probably don't agree on. Um, I really want to stay in relationship with you. If I just come out and assume that you're not going to change my mind and I'm not going to change yours, I still would you be willing? Would you be willing to stay in relationship with me even knowing that I won't change your mind and you won't change mine?
That's fantastic.
And that way it's putting it on them. Are they
Yeah.
willing to be in relationship with you? Because if they're not willing to be in relationship with you, this is where I think that God does allow us to say, you know what, shake the dust off your heels. You've tried. I would say always reach out again in like maybe 3 weeks later, maybe 6 weeks later, just always kind of reach out checking in, because you never know when they're going to have that time when they realize, "Oh my gosh, all these people who quote unquote love me because they use my right pronouns, they've all abandoned me." And if you're just checking in every now and then, you can be like, "Hey, I'm still assuming that you and I aren't going to agree on this. I just want you to know that whenever you're ready for a relationship again, I would love to have that relationship." And you just always keep that door open to where if someone's rejecting someone, it's very clear who
Yeah.
is rejecting whom.
Mm. That is fantastic. I mean, and that's just words of wisdom for life, but especially in this emotionally charged area that we are having to deal with more and more. I love that, just kind of like putting the onus on them of, here, I'm available to you,
Yeah.
and actually, no, I'm not rejecting you. I'm still so willing to engage with you and do life. And that's where the heart of love where you are comes in
Yeah.
terms of living your life in such a way that not only have they seen that they're willing, that you are willing to stay and have that example even of healthy exchange and relationship rather than just the blow up and becoming enemies, which is ultimately what our enemy himself wants,
Yeah.
is to break relationship and to prevent these people from hearing the truth.
Yeah.
And also seeing it displayed in the way that we live, the way that we interact with our families, and the way that we have offered that relationship to them. I think that is fantastic, Hillary. I absolutely love that. And I have loved this conversation. And I would love to welcome you back again just for a part two, or for any other topic that I know would be so relevant to our listeners today. But I want to make sure that our listeners can get a copy of Mama Bear Apologetics Guide to Sexuality, and they can continue to connect with and learn from you through the podcast. Let us know how they can find you,
Yep.
and continue to hear from you.
So first off, I just want to say, I think our study guide, which we call the discipleship workbook, has totally gone under the radar. I put so much work into that, creating little things that are discipleship activities to do with your kids, breaking these concepts down, because we have this oppressive mistress called word count when it comes to writing books and articles, and so you can only get so much in there. And so I was able to take a lot of the things that I wanted to include in the book and put it in the discipleship workbook. So it
Right.
acts just like the study guide from the first book, but then it also has all these different activities.
That's awesome.
I'd like, yeah, I won't go into all those, but they've got some really great activities in order to unpack these things in a way that your children will understand. So I'd say first off, if you're studying it by yourself or if you're studying it with a group, make sure somebody has what's it called, access to that discipleship workbook. It's a study guide, but it's got even more than that. Beyond that, we're at mamabearapologetics.com, and that's spelled MAMA, not all those wacky ways that other people spell it. And
Right.
we're on, well, we're kind of on Twitter. We post there, but I don't know how much interaction we do. I kind of consider that the wasteland, but it's gotten better.
Right.
And on Instagram, that Instagram is my favorite just because I have all sorts of, happy things that I follow. I don't have to see all the depressing stuff. Did you
Right.
know that there's actually an account that's called Ek, it's spelled EK, and it's the sound that those cats make when they see a bird that out there that they're like ek, 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 ek.
Yeah.
It's a whole account that's just stuff like that. And I'm like, you know what,
Okay, that's entertainment.
that's a God glorifying use of technology, in my opinion. So, yeah, you can find us on Instagram. You can find us on Facebook. We have a contact on the Mama Bear Apologetics website that you can contact with us with questions. So if you want to find us, you can find us.
Yes, absolutely. And you will be able to find her easily. As you know, I will post all of those links in the show notes for you to go back and refer to today. Hillary, it has been such a pleasure getting to know you and learning from you. I'm so grateful for your ministry and all that you're doing. Thank you so much for being my guest today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to Called to Love today. I love to hear from listeners, and so I would love to connect with you to hear your stories and answer your questions right here on the show. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram, send me a direct message, or send me an email at the link in today's show notes. I pray you have been encouraged by today's episode to walk in faith and continue to embrace your own call to love. Until next time, blessings, sweet friends.